Jared knew it the moment he first set foot on its dry, cracked surface. The air was thin, heavy with dust, and every breath felt like inhaling sand. Once, this world had been full of life. Cities, rivers, green forests. Now it was nothing but ruins, broken structures swallowed by the creeping wasteland. He pulled his scarf tighter around his mouth and stepped forward, his boots crunching against loose debris. The sky above was a dull orange, the sun barely visible through thick, swirling clouds. Food was running out. Water was even scarcer. He had been surviving on whatever scraps he could scavenge from abandoned buildings, but each day it became harder. Jared wasn't the only one left on this forsaken rock. Others roamed the ruins, desperate survivors, ruthless scavengers, and dangerous creatures mutated by the planet's failing atmosphere. Trust was a rare thing here. Most people would rather take what they needed by force. He climbed over a fallen metal beam and reached the remains of an old market. The place had already been picked clean by others, but he still searched. His fingers brushed over a rusted tin, long since emptied, before his eyes landed on something unexpected. A small cloth bundle tucked inside a broken crate. Jared's heart pounded as he reached for it. Carefully, he unwrapped the fabric. Inside was a single piece of bread. It was dry and stale, but it was food. His stomach twisted in hunger just looking at it. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. Taking a slow breath, he picked it up and tucked it into his pouch. He would make it last. Just as he was about to leave, a faint sound reached his ears. A weak, ragged breath. Jared froze. He turned his head slowly, scanning the area. Behind a collapsed stall, hidden under a pile of torn fabric, something moved. He took a cautious step forward, hand resting on the hilt of the small knife at his belt. Survivors were unpredictable. Some would beg for help, others would stab you the moment you got close. Jared pulled the fabric aside and felt his breath catch. A woman. No, not human. She was alien, her skin a deep shade of violet, her eyes large and filled with exhaustion. Her body was frail, her arms thin, her lips cracked from dehydration. She wore tattered clothing that once might have been elegant, but now it was barely holding together. She looked at him, eyes wide with fear. Jared took a slow step back, raising his hand slightly to show he wasn't a threat. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice hoarse from the dry air. She didn't respond. Instead, she struggled to sit up, but her body was too weak. She collapsed again, breathing heavily. Jared hesitated. He should leave. More mouths to feed meant less food for himself. He barely had enough for one person, let alone two. But something about the way she looked at him, her silent, desperate gaze, made him pause. With a sigh, he reached into his pouch. His fingers closed around the piece of bread. It was all he had. He knelt beside her and carefully broke the bread in half. Slowly, he extended a piece toward her. Her eyes widened. Tears formed at the corners, slipping down her dirt-covered cheeks. Her hands trembled as she reached for the bread, as if she couldn't believe what was happening. She took it gently, holding it as if it were the most precious thing in the universe. Then she looked at him again, this time with something beyond gratitude. Something deeper. Jared didn't know what it was, but he had a feeling that from this moment on, his life would never be the same. Jared sat back against the ruined wall, watching the alien woman eat. She took small, careful bites, as if afraid the bread might disappear if she ate too fast. Her hands trembled as she held the piece of food. Her violet skin looked dull, and the deep ridges under her eyes showed how long she had gone without eating. She was starving. Jared sighed and looked away. So was he. That bread had been his last ration. Now he had nothing. The dry wind howled through the crumbling buildings, lifting clouds of dust into the air. Jared pulled his scarf over his mouth and tried to ignore the hunger twisting inside him. The woman finished eating and slowly lifted her head. Her large eyes met his, filled with something he couldn't quite understand. Gratitude. Sadness. Guilt? She said something in a language he didn't know. Her voice was soft, weak. I don't understand, Jared said, shaking his head. She hesitated, then tried again in another language, one he barely recognized. Why did you give it to me? Jared exhaled and looked up at the orange sky. The clouds were getting darker. A storm was coming. You needed it more, he said simply. She blinked, as if she couldn't believe his words. Then she whispered something to herself, her voice too quiet to hear. Jared stood up and dusted off his jacket. We can't stay here. A sandstorm is coming. The woman looked around as if noticing the sky for the first time. Her eyes widened with fear. You have a place to stay? Jared asked. She shook her head. Of course not. If she had a shelter, she wouldn't be half dead under a pile of old fabric. Jared rubbed his temples. This wasn't his problem. He should leave her, find a safer place before the storm hit. He didn't have food. He didn't have water. He could barely keep himself alive. But when he looked at her again, he saw not just an alien, but a survivor, just like him. He let out a frustrated sigh. Fine, you can come with me. She stared at him, unsure if she had heard correctly. Move, Jared said, unless you want to get buried in the storm. She didn't argue. Struggling to stand, she pushed herself up but stumbled. Jared caught her arm before she could fall. Easy, he muttered. You're too weak. She flinched at his touch but didn't resist. Her skin was cold, too cold. How long had she been starving? Jared pulled her arm over his shoulder and helped her walk. They moved slowly through the ruined marketplace, past abandoned stalls and rusted metal scraps. The wind was getting stronger. Every step felt like dragging lead, but they finally reached a crumbling shelter made of stone and metal. It had once been a shop, but now it was barely standing. Still, it was better than nothing. Jared guided her inside and set her down against the wall. Then he quickly pulled out a tattered tarp and covered the broken entrance. The storm arrived moments later. The wind roared like a beast, shaking the walls, sending dust through the cracks. Jared covered his face with his sleeve and sat down across from the woman. She pulled her knees to her chest, shivering despite the heat. Jared reached into his pouch out of habit, but there was nothing left inside. No food, no water. They weren't going to last long like this. The woman shifted slightly, her eyes locked on him. You, human? She asked in her broken language. Jared nodded. Yeah. She hesitated, then touched her chest weakly. Lyra, she said. It took him a moment to realize she was telling him her name. Lyra, he repeated. It sounded strange on his tongue, but she nodded. Then she pointed at him. Jared, he said. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say more, but she was too exhausted. The storm outside howled louder, rattling the structure. They sat in silence, two strangers, two survivors, trapped in a dying world. And for the first time in a long time, Jared wasn't alone. The storm outside was relentless. The wind roared like a wild beast, rattling the old metal walls of their shelter. Dust seeped through the cracks, filling the air with a dry, choking scent. Jared sat with his back against the cold stone wall, arms crossed over his chest. Across from him, Lyra curled up, shivering despite the warmth of the storm-heated air. She was weak, too weak. The little piece of bread he had given her wasn't enough. She needed real food, clean water, and shelter that wouldn't collapse any second. But Jared had none of those things. His stomach growled, reminding him of his own hunger. He ignored it. Outside, the storm screamed, tearing through the abandoned buildings. Sandstorms on this planet could last hours, sometimes even days. Jared exhaled and glanced at Lyra. She was staring at him. Her violet eyes were filled with silent curiosity, but also uncertainty. She had probably never been this close to a human before. Jared leaned his head back against the wall, breaking eye contact. He wasn't good at talking, even with his own kind. But after a moment, Lyra spoke. "Jared," she said softly. His gaze flickered back to her. She had remembered his name. She hesitated, then placed a hand on her chest. "Lyra." Jared nodded. "I know." Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say more, but she struggled with the words. Her language was different, strange, yet familiar. She tried again. "You? From where?" Jared let out a dry chuckle. "That's a long story." He pointed up, toward the sky, though they couldn't see it from inside. "Another planet. Not this one." Liara blinked, processing his words. "Home?" she asked. Jared hesitated. Was Earth still his home? He had left it long ago. The galaxy was a cruel place, and he had spent most of his life jumping from one dying world to another. Finally, he shrugged. "Not anymore." Liara looked down at her hands. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she whispered, "Me, too." Jared frowned. "You're not from here." She shook her head. Jared studied her face. Her skin was pale for her species, as if she had been without proper nutrition for a long time. The deep shadows under her eyes told him everything. She had suffered. "What happened?" Jared asked, even though he wasn't sure she could explain. Liara took a deep breath. Then, slowly, she began to speak. She struggled with the words, but Jared understood enough. Her people had abandoned this planet years ago, when the environment became too harsh. But not everyone made it onto the escape ships. Some were left behind. The weak, the sick, the ones who were no longer useful. Jared clenched his fists. So she had been abandoned. Liara's voice grew quieter. "They, gone. I stay. Alone." Jared exhaled sharply. He had seen this happen before. In desperate times, civilizations always left someone behind. It was survival. Didn't mean it was right. For the first time, Jared saw not just an alien, but someone like him. She had lost her people. He had lost his home. Maybe they weren't so different after all. Lara looked at him again, her violet eyes filled with something fragile. "You help me." Jared rubbed his temples. "I already gave you my last piece of bread, didn't I?" Her lips parted slightly in surprise. Then, to his shock, she smiled, a small, tired smile, but real. Jared shook his head. "I must be crazy." The storm outside finally began to weaken, the wind settling into a steady hum. Jared stood up and stretched. "All right," he muttered. "We can't stay here forever." Liara tried to stand, but her legs were too weak. Jared sighed and crouched beside her. "Come on," he said, offering his hand. She hesitated for a moment, then slowly placed her fingers in his. Her skin was cold against his, but her grip was strong. Jared pulled her to her feet. They stood there for a moment, a human and an abandoned alien, two strangers on a dying world. Then Jared took a step forward, and Lyra followed. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world of silence. Jared stepped outside first, his boots crunching against the fresh layer of dust that covered the ground. The sky was still heavy with thick orange clouds, but the winds had calmed. Liara followed behind him, moving carefully. She was still weak, but at least she could walk on her own now. Jared scanned the ruins ahead. They needed food. They needed water. And if they were going to survive, they had to find both fast. "This way," Jared said, motioning for Lyra to follow. She nodded without question. They walked through the wreckage of the old city, stepping over broken metal beams and shattered glass. Jared kept his eyes sharp, scanning every shadow. The planet was mostly abandoned, but there were others out here. Not all of them were friendly. Lyra walked beside him, silent but observant. He could tell she was still weak, but she was trying to keep up. Jared sighed. He wasn't used to traveling with someone else. He had been alone for so long that having company felt strange, but he didn't regret helping her. Not yet, anyway. After nearly an hour of walking, they found what they were looking for. An old supply bunker, half buried under collapsed buildings. The metal doors were rusted, but still intact. This place might still have food, Jared said. Liara tilted her head. Danger. Jared smirked. Always. He knelt by the entrance and tested the door. Locked. Of course it was. He pulled out his knife and wedged it into the rusted lock, twisting it with careful pressure. Liara crouched beside him, watching closely. The lock snapped. Jared pushed the door open, and the stale smell of dust and metal filled the air. The bunker was dark, but not empty. Something had been living here. Jared stepped inside cautiously. His hand hovered near his knife. Liara followed behind, her breathing quiet but controlled. Inside, old metal shelves lined the walls, most of them empty. Discarded ration packs, broken water containers, and torn sleeping bags were scattered across the floor. Then Jared spotted something in the corner. A crate, still sealed. Jackpot, he muttered, stepping toward it. But before he could take another step, a sound echoed through the room. A low, guttural growl. Jared froze. Liara tensed beside him. From the darkness, a creature emerged, thin, starved, but still dangerous. Its body was covered in matted fur, its claws sharp from survival. It had been living here, and it was not happy to see intruders. Jared took a slow step back. Liara grabbed his arm. What is that? Jared kept his voice calm. A problem. The creature lowered itself, ready to attack. Jared moved first. He grabbed a piece of metal from the ground and threw it across the room. The sound distracted the beast for just a second, enough time for him to grab Liara's hand and run. The creature roared and lunged. Jared yanked Liara forward, shoving her through the bunker doors. They barely made it outside before the beast slammed into the doorway, snarling. Jared kicked the door shut and jammed a metal rod through the handle. The creature slammed against it once, twice, then went silent. Jared let out a breath. Well, that was fun. Liara gave him a look that clearly meant that was not fun. Jared wiped the sweat from his forehead. Good news, we found food. Bad news, it wants to eat us first. Liara looked back at the bunker door. We go back. Jared nodded. Yeah, but we do it smarter this time. She hesitated. Then, for the first time, she smirked. Jared raised an eyebrow. You've got an idea, don't you? She nodded. Jared sighed. He had a feeling this was going to be interesting. The bunker was still there. The food was still inside. And so was the creature. Jared stood outside, hands on his hips, staring at the sealed metal door. They needed that crate. He wasn't about to leave without it. Liara crouched beside him, her violet eyes sharp. How we take? Jared glanced at her. She was still weak, but there was a new determination in her voice. She had survived this long. She wasn't just a helpless victim. He smirked. We're going to outsmart it. Liara tilted her head. How? Jared knelt and picked up a handful of small rocks from the ground. We distract it again. But this time, I'll be inside before it knows what's happening. Liara frowned. Too dangerous. Jared shrugged. Everything on this planet is dangerous. If we don't get food, we die anyway. Liara was quiet for a moment, then nodded. I help. Jared raised an eyebrow. You sure? She met his gaze. You help me. Now I help you. Jared let out a breath. Fair enough. They worked quickly. Liara positioned herself a few feet from the entrance, holding the small rocks Jared had given her. Jared crouched beside the bunker door, ready to move. Liara threw the first rock. It clattered loudly inside the bunker. The creature snarled from the darkness, but didn't move. She threw another rock, harder this time. The growl turned into a low rumble. Then suddenly, the beast lunged toward the noise, smashing into the opposite side of the bunker. Jared moved. He slipped inside, keeping low, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The beast was distracted, its back turned toward him. This was his chance. He crept forward, inching toward the crate. Every step felt like a lifetime. Finally, his fingers touched the metal surface. He grabbed the crate's handle and started dragging it back. But then the creature turned. Jared froze. For a moment, neither moved. The beast's yellow eyes locked onto him, and its lips curled into a snarl. Then it pounced. Jared barely rolled out of the way in time. The beast slammed into the crate, knocking it over. It was faster than he expected. Jared, Lyra's voice echoed from outside. He gritted his teeth and grabbed a nearby metal pipe, gripping it tightly. The creature snarled and charged again. This time, Jared didn't run. He swung the pipe with everything he had. Crack! The metal slammed into the beast's skull. It stumbled, letting out a pained growl. Jared didn't hesitate. He grabbed the crate and threw it toward the entrance. Lyra caught it with both hands, her arms shaking under the weight. "Go!" Jared shouted. She hesitated for only a second before she turned and ran. Jared wasn't far behind. He sprinted toward the exit, heart pounding. The creature roared and lunged, claws slashing through the air. Jared dived. He hit the ground and rolled, crashing through the doorway, just as Lyra slammed the bunker door shut behind him. The beast roared in fury, slamming against the metal. But the door held. Silence. Jared lay on his back, breathing hard. Then he started laughing. Lyra looked at him like he was insane. "That was stupid," she said breathlessly. Jared grinned. "Yeah, but it worked." She stared at him for a moment, then laughed too. It was the first real laugh he had heard from her. Jared sat up and looked at the crate. Inside was food, water, and even a few medical supplies. They had done it. For the first time in a long time, Jared felt something strange. Hope. Lyra looked at him, eyes filled with something he recognized. Respect. Trust. Gratitude. Maybe they really could survive this. Together. The moment Jared opened the crate, a sense of relief washed over him. They had food. They had water. But the feeling didn't last long. Lyra sat down beside him, carefully inspecting the contents of the crate. There were ration packs, a few bottles of water, and some medical supplies, bandages, antiseptic, even a couple of painkillers. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give them a chance. Jared tore open one of the ration packs and handed it to Lyra. She looked at it for a moment, unsure of how to eat it. Jared showed her how to open the package and take a bite. The food was tasteless, but it was filling. They ate in silence for a while, both too exhausted to speak. The storm outside had passed, but the wind still howled through the wreckage of the city, carrying with it the scent of the dying planet. Jared knew this wasn't enough. They had food, but they didn't have a way out. The planet was dying, and soon it would be uninhabitable. If they stayed too long, they would be trapped. "Lyra," Jared said, breaking the silence. "We can't stay here forever. We need to find a way off this planet." She looked at him, her violet eyes wide with uncertainty. "How?" Jared stared at the crate, trying to think. The only way off the planet was through the old spaceport on the other side of the city. It was abandoned, but there might still be a ship there. It was a long shot, but it was their only shot. "I've been to the spaceport before," Jared said slowly. "It's not far from here, but it's dangerous. There are other survivors. Some of them are desperate enough to attack anyone who comes near, and the buildings are unstable. But if we're careful, we might be able to make it." Lyra didn't say anything for a moment. She just stared at him, as if weighing his words. "Can you help me?" Jared asked. She nodded, though her eyes were filled with worry. "I help." Jared stood up and pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders. It was still cold, the wind cutting through the ruins like a knife. "Let's go," he said. The journey to the spaceport was slow. Every step they took was careful, as they avoided the dangerous, crumbling buildings. The streets were littered with debris, and the air was thick with dust and ash. The sun, blocked by the clouds, barely illuminated the path ahead. Liara moved quietly beside him, her steps light and steady despite her earlier weakness. She was strong, stronger than Jared had given her credit for. They reached the edge of the city just as the sun began to set. The spaceport loomed in the distance, a broken, rusted structure surrounded by scattered wreckage. Jared's heart raced. He had been here before, years ago, when the spaceport was still operational. Back then, it had been a bustling hub of activity, filled with ships and people coming and going. Now it was just a shadow of its former self. He motioned for Liara to stay close as they moved toward the entrance. The metal doors were rusted and half open, but the real danger lay beyond. Inside the spaceport, they would have to be careful. Jared's eyes darted around the area, scanning for movement. There were signs of life, footprints in the dust, old fires still smoldering in the corners of the room. But there was no sign of anyone nearby. "Stay low," he whispered to Lara. "We don't know who might be here." They crept inside, moving cautiously past old crates and broken machinery. The interior of the spaceport was even more decayed than the outside. The walls were cracked, and the floors were covered in layers of dust and rust. But there, in the far corner, was a ship. It wasn't much, a small transport ship, barely functional, but it was a ship, and that was all they needed. Jared's heart skipped a beat as he rushed toward it. "We're almost there," he said, his voice tight with excitement. But just as he reached the ship, he heard a noise behind him, a soft shuffle. He turned, his hand on the knife at his belt. And then he saw them, a group of survivors. They were armed, their faces dirty and gaunt from the same hunger and desperation that had driven Jared to this point. "You're not going anywhere," one of them said, stepping forward. His voice was rough, and his eyes were full of distrust. Jared's mind raced. They were outnumbered, but he couldn't give up now. "We don't want trouble," Jared said, trying to keep his voice calm. "We just need to leave. We'll be gone, and you won't see us again." The man's eyes narrowed. "You think we're letting you take that ship?" Jared's grip tightened on his knife. Liara moved behind him, standing tall despite the danger. She had no weapon, but there was something in the way she looked at the survivors that made them hesitate. "We just need to go," Jared repeated. The man studied them for a long moment. Then he made a decision. "Fine," he said, stepping back. "But don't come back. This place is ours now." Jared didn't need to be told twice. He turned and ran for the ship, pulling Liara behind him. The transport ship was closer now. Every step they took toward it felt like the promise of something better, something far from this dying world. The distant hum of the ship's engine had a strange comfort to it, a sound that whispered of hope in a way nothing else on this forsaken planet ever had. Jared's hand trembled as he reached for the ship's hatch. Liara was right behind him, her violet eyes alert, scanning their surroundings. The tension in the air was thick, and every creaking sound from the ship felt like a countdown. They had made it this far, but they weren't out of danger yet. Jared knew that well enough. The survivors they'd left behind could change their minds at any moment, and if they were anything like the bandits back at the bunker, they wouldn't hesitate to attack. But for now, they were in the clear. Jared pushed the hatch open, the squeal of old metal making him wince. The interior was dim, but at least it was a shelter, a place to breathe. Liara stepped inside first, her movements cautious but eager. She didn't say anything, but Jared could see the relief on her face. She was safe, for now. He followed her in, shutting the hatch behind them with a soft thud. The ship wasn't large, just enough space for a small crew, but that was all they needed. Liara moved to the control panel, studying it with a mix of curiosity and confusion. It wasn't like the technology she was used to. Jared had been in ships like this before, so he knew where to start. He found the power switch and pressed it, listening as the lights flickered on. "This should work," Jared muttered, more to himself than to Lyra. He could feel his heart racing in his chest. The ship was old, but it still had power. It was their ticket out. Lyra turned to him. "How fly?" she asked softly. Jared smiled at her. "I'll show you." The minutes passed quickly as Jared worked the controls. The ship came to life with a low hum, the sound of its engines purring like a beast ready to run. He checked the systems. Everything seemed functional, but he didn't know how long it would last. The ship wasn't in perfect condition. Lyra watched him closely, her eyes following every movement, as if she were learning a language she had never known. Jared could see the wheels turning in her mind, wondering what was next. He glanced over at her and saw the determination in her face. She wasn't scared anymore. She had decided to follow him, to trust him. And now she was part of this journey. Jared ran a hand through his hair. He wasn't a pilot, but he'd flown enough to know how to get this ship in the air. He set the coordinates for the nearest space station. It was a long shot, but it was the closest place with a chance of getting real help. "We're going to make it," Jared said, mostly to reassure himself. He activated the launch sequence. Lyra looked out the small window, her expression unreadable. The world outside was slowly getting smaller, the gray sky and dying ruins shrinking as the ship rose higher. Jared held his breath as the ship lifted off, the ground shaking beneath them. The ship's engines roared to life, pushing them into the sky. They were free. But as they ascended, the planet below seemed to grow darker. Jared couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. They were leaving behind so much, so many people who didn't have a way out. He glanced over at Lyra, her face soft with the realization of what they were doing. "What happens to them?" she asked quietly. Jared swallowed, trying to put into words what he had never been able to explain to himself. "We can't save everyone," he said softly, "but we can keep going. We can survive. That's all we can do now." Lyra nodded slowly, as if understanding. She leaned back in her seat, her eyes closing as she took in the strange sensation of freedom, even if it was only temporary. Jared stared out the window, watching as the dying planet grew smaller in the distance. He felt a weight in his chest, but there was something else there too, relief and a kind of hope. The stars ahead felt closer now, as if they were waiting for him, for both of them. But just as the ship began to stabilize, an unexpected voice broke the silence. "You're not leaving, are you?" Jared's heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the door. A figure stood in the doorway, the leader of the survivors from the spaceport. The man's face was hard, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. Jared quickly moved in front of Lyra, shielding her. "We're leaving. This ship is ours now." The man stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife. "I don't think so. You think you can just take our ship and leave?" Jared's eyes flashed. "I don't want any more trouble. Let us go." The man didn't answer right away. There was a long silence before he spoke again, his voice low. "You don't understand. This planet, it's all we've got. You can't just walk away from it." Jared's hands tightened. "We don't have a choice." For a moment, the man stared at him. Then, slowly, he took a step back. "Fine, but don't think you're safe." Jared exhaled, his body tensing as the man left the ship. For now, they were free. Lyra turned to him, her eyes wide. "We go?" Jared nodded, his grip loosening. "We go. And this time, nothing was going to stop them."